in a way, neither of these gentlemen needs an introduction. We all know Mako Fujimura very well, our beloved parishioner and artist. Yes. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce the Reverend Dr. Gordon Graham, as we know him. He spent many years with us and we're comfortable with him, but you may not know, well, I don't know everything about him, but I'm going to share perhaps a bit more than you might have known about him. That what we probably did know is that he is the Professor Emeritus of Philosophy in the Arts at Princeton Seminary, where he also served as the director of the Center for the Study of Scottish Philosophy. Before coming to Princeton, he was Regius Professor of Moral Philosophy at the University of Aberdeen. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, a founding trustee of the SOCO Fund, which promotes the education of women in Malawi. And in 2021, he was honored with the Lifetime Achievement Award of the 18th Century Scottish Studies Society. Currently, he serves as the chair of the Edinburgh Sacred Arts Foundation and directs the annual Festival of the Sacred Arts at the Fringe. But we know him as Gordon, as he spent many years directing a wonderful adult forum program, bringing in wonderful scholars, speakers from literally international speakers, but local speakers as well. So we're grateful to have a friend returning to speak with us and to have Mako interviewing him. I know this is going to be an inspiring and thought-provoking conversation. And before we begin, let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for your mercies, which are new every morning. And we thank you for reunions with old friends. We thank you for bringing Gordon safely here to the United States for this conference and for this adult forum and this time that we have together. We ask that you would bless this conversation, that you would open the eyes of our hearts and minds, that we might behold more of your glory, of your goodness, of your truth, and of your beauty. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Mako Fujimura and Gordon Graham.
Thank you, Mr. George, and welcome to this kind of an inaugural conversation. Hedgen and I have been working with Dr. George and others to try to revamp Christian education here. It's always been a highlight of mine. And one of my greatest memories is finding out that Dr. Graham led it for some time here in All Saints. And I was introduced to Gordon's work in, I believe, in mid-2000s. A friend of mine gave me, excuse me, a friend of mine gave me a copy of his book on philosophy, on the arts, and said, "This is extraordinary, you have to read it." I literally felt like I was devouring this much needed perspective, which we don't get much of in America. And then found out that he was here serving, and that I get to sit in this Christian education class led by him for free. What is this? That's so amazing. Anyway, so, and then later on, Gordon was kind enough to be one of the readers for one of my books, Silence and Beauty, and I got to know him a little bit more. But I want to start with your role at All Saints and at Princeton Seminary. The duration of the time that you served with us and while you were here in Princeton. Tell us what your experience was like, and also what it means to you to be back at All Saints.
Thank you very much. Well, I can say what a delight and pleasure it is to be back. And actually, the last few days at Princeton, I've had this strange experience of knowing I don't live here, but feeling I'm at home. And this is a rather odd, but very pleasant and agreeable experience. I was actually ordained a deacon just about the time I moved to the United States, and I was instructed by my bishop, the Bishop of Aberdeen, to go and see the Bishop of New Jersey, who was at that time a most marvellous man whom I always loved and honoured, revered in fact, Bishop George Cancel. And I went to him and he said, the best thing you can do for us is go back and get yourself ordained priest, because our system is so complicated. It would take, you might be gone before it would happen. So that's what I did. And then he duly assigned me, and for 12 and a half years, and part of that time I was at St. David's Cranberry, and then one day Bishop George said, I think that Hugh at All Saints could do with some assistance, and so that's how I ended up here and was here for 6 years. And I had a special opportunity because Hugh was doing a further degree, so once a month he had to be away, and so once a month I took care of things in his absence, and that's a wonderful way to get to know people, get a feel of a place. Now I drop in, I drop out back in Scotland to places, and I do sort of get to know people, but not the same. Here I think was special for that reason.
I noticed when you were doing that once a month, you would preach on the 8 o'clock, teach at 9, and preach again at 10:15. And it felt to me like it was like a triathlon, you know, athlete running. And I was like, how do you do this? And yet I saw in every part of that what you just reflected on, which is your passion for community and also Christian education. So tell us about what Christian education means to you and why you're so passionate about serving in a local church.
Well, let me say something about, of course, I'm a philosopher by trade and not a theologian or a church historian or anything. And it is the task of philosophy, as I have always understood it, to think critically in a somewhat distance. I was inspired as a student by a collection of essays by a very famous philosopher, actually, Alistair MacIntyre, whose name won't mean anything here, I suppose. But this collection of essays had the title, Against the Self-Images of the Age. I thought, what a wonderful title it is. It wasn't against the age, it was against the self-images of the age. And his understanding was to call up how we think about ourselves and say, wait, why do we think that? Is that the right way to think? Should we think of our lives together or over time like that? And then I realized that actually to try and do that from a Christian perspective, try to say, well, what is the Christian slant on this or that, is something that actually rather rarely happens. And partly it rarely happens because the church, unfortunately in my view, is a bit inclined to bandwagon. You take the latest cause, whatever it might be, and you will find that church leaders, church documents will say, we believe that, we believe that. So when you take the issues that confront us, my interest and question, whether those issues are immediately contemporaneous or whether they are long-standing, my first question is this: what difference does it make in thinking about these things to be a Christian? That's the first question. And it's almost a happy accident, almost. But anyway, it's where I've come from. But philosophical thinking enables you to do that. I think that theology, properly so called, is kind of top-down stuff, and it's not, to be honest, it's not everybody's taste or everybody's systematic theology. But this way of approaching it says, to people, what does it mean to you, to us, to the world, that you are a Christian?
And that, to me, was my first introduction to your work, being an artist, and somewhat a suspect being in the church to begin with, right? If you're an artist or if you're Christian, you get kind of exiled from both worlds. You know, your artist friends think you're strange because you follow Jesus and have these moral values and ethical standards. And then you could come to church, oftentimes, not here, but oftentimes I experience people kind of questioning, how can you be an artist in this corrupt world? And when I read your work, it seemed that your philosophy, which I had to really dig into to understand, I'm beginning to understand it really, but it seemed like it had a broader impact in culture, the world at large, that you actually cared about those things. And there were very few people at the time that I could learn from that connected what I do as an artist outside of the church, let's say, and what was, you know, my convictions about the gospel, reality of Jesus in the world, and how important and integrated they were. It's as if, you know, these paintings cannot be done without having a perspective, theological perspective of, you know, as you mentioned, who we are and what that means in the world. And so in light of what you have written, I wonder if you could reflect further on that, because we can go into a rabbit hole here, so I have to be careful because I can interview him for like 3 hours. But how do you frame that to all of us Christians? How can philosophy and even, you know, theology that relies on a certain perspective of thinking help us as Christians on a journey?
Well, let me just say something about the arts, and this reflects my experience since leaving here and in Edinburgh. George mentioned that I'm connected with, and have been since before I left here actually, a thing called the Edinburgh Festival of the Sacred Arts. And that happens in the middle week of the Edinburgh Festival season. And it began in this way. Before I left Princeton actually, but knew that I would be moving back. I was on a bus, and on the top story of a double-decker bus. And there were two little boys, not youngish boys in front of me, who had this exchange. We were passing a church, and it was festival time, and there were notices for festival events. And one kid said to the other, "Why is it that so many churches are festival events?" And just like that, his friend replied, "Because nobody has use for them as churches anymore." And I thought, now that's interesting. Is there some way in which those many churches that are venues at festival time could actually do something that churches should be doing, and as venues, and as part of the culture? Is there a way in which the church, pursuing its own life, can enter into and be part of the cultural life of the city at this particularly energetic time? And so that's where we started building that, because, you know, and this is the second point I want to make, it's very, very easy for churches to fool themselves. They have a concert, they have an exhibition, people come, and they say, this is a way of drawing people into the church. But here's a question: does it draw people into the church as church, or as a beautiful concert space, a lovely exhibition space? And the key task is to say, to my mind, the key task is we want people to come into the church, and we want to find ways that will draw them into the church, but as church. And I hardly need to tell you that for most of the history of the church, art, visual art, music, literature, and Christian faith have been interwoven. It's really only in the last, say, 100 years or so that they have taken their own path. And not long after I came here, I published a book that had the subtitle, Art as a Rival to Religion. And I think that's a real phenomenon. So the task is to recover what it is for something to be sacred art and not merely art as the rest of the world understands it. How do you hold these? And I think that again and again and again. So if I may just pass on to other issues. So if you take something like diversity and inclusion, which is absolutely dominant. Yeah, but is the church, when it pursues its policies, same thing would be true of environmentalism, when it pursues its policies and advocates, is it taking its agenda from somewhere else? Or is it bringing its agenda to these issues? And I could say more about that, especially about environmentalism, because it's something that interests me greatly. Anyway, that's my thought. That we, to go back to your point, yes, we want to incorporate, to draw upon, to raise up the wonderful work of art and music and the visual and the literary and so on, and to tell the world, hey, this is something worth it, but to tell it on the church's terms or the faith's terms and not simply on the world's terms. And it's terribly easy to just go slightly in the wrong direction.
And let's talk further about that, because there's
Alan's wanted to chip in, so.
oh yeah, there'll be Q&A, so I'm going to make sure we have time. So what you're saying, if I could rephrase it, is that we tend to get drawn into philosophical terms that the world provides, rather than have this conviction about our faith, and especially in light of where we are standing, which is at the heart of worship, which is the Eucharist, and the story that we have learned to honor as Christians. And there's a philosophical negotiation, at least, that takes place when anybody, whether you're a plumber or an artist or a pastor, that we have to begin to understand a philosophical basis, right? Like, how do we know what we know is one question, but also how do we think about our faith in the context of what is in the world? Is that, and in answering, perhaps expanding that, talk a little bit about creation care, what you're passionate about in terms of this God is green idea. Is God green? And how that philosophical negotiation can help us to see creation as something perhaps different from what is typically talked about in the world.
I mean, this is a rather large subject. So,
yes.
Actually, as it happens, in the journal called Theology Today, I'm publishing an essay this month, or next month, or sometime, environmentalism as a religion. And in that, I try and construct the way in which environmentalism takes on the character of a rival religion. But let me, so I think that's one way of thinking. But let me say, many years ago, as a well-known Scottish writer, journalist come cleric, published a book called God is Green. And I read it at the time and thought, this is just a little bit of bandwagoning. So the green agenda was rising. Hey, us too, was there? So that's the point of my question: is God green? And that I wanted to weave that in to a very significant step. Now, it's a very recent step in America. It's older in Europe. That is to say, the institution of a liturgical season called Creation Tide. And this began quite a long time ago when the principal figure in the Orthodox Church, the Orthodox year begins on the 1st September, and that was labeled Creation Day. And then, as you all know, for some time, the observation of October the 4th, which is St. Francis Day, had arisen. So slowly, over a few years, the Pope and then the Church of England and so on, Lutherans, I believe, they decided that between these 2 days, this should be a season dedicated to the reverence and thought about creation. And so what interested me, and this is how I got started in this, was, well, is Creation Tide actually a distinctively Christian season? And if so, how? And the truth is, the sad truth in my view is, if you look at all the writing about it, you see that actually a lot of what is said and done for Creation Tide is simply piling on the stuff that is out there anyway. So I was trying to step back and say, we want to think about this. And anyway, very, very quickly, let me say, the key difference between the environmental movement in almost all its manifestations and a Christian understanding of creation, the key difference is that in environmentalism, there is the constant risk of the sin of hubris. And the sin of hubris is this: the belief that we can be our own salvation. This is a profound error. If only we get together, if we are good-willed, if we have the right intentions, if we put the right resources, if we all come together, if we all talk together, think together, work together, we can put it right. And that's hubris. Only God saves.
And that actually is so prevalent in today's tech culture as
Of
well,
course.
right? Like the consideration of everything from AI to how to say, this idea of singularity. And it seems to me, when I was exploring this philosophy behind the arts, let's say, a thought occurred to me that would we have even a concept of beauty that Western civilization has developed, or even a concept of justice, without having a Christological, basis? And it's an ongoing question that I'm exploring right now, writing a book with my wife. But it really made me realize, people try to define justice, or maybe we assume that it's defined, but oftentimes we do it without really defining it or having a thoughtful, understanding of the history and thought behind the thought. And one of I think what I appreciate about your writing and teaching has been to even ask that question, because we take for granted what is, assumed.
Yes.
So we can be side to side with the environmental movement and so forth, but and only God saves. So what does it mean for us operating in different spheres, fighting for different things, perhaps advocating for different things, to have a Christological, centerpiece? How does that translate into our work, our everyday lives, and so forth?
Well, I think if I'm pressed to focus on one aspect, I think I would describe it as acting with humility. So what I call the sin of hubris, I mean, the Latin is superb, it's all a version of pride. I mean, traditional Christian thinking, it's all a version of pride. And set pride aside. So Bach has a chorale, prelude, with the wonderful title, God's time is the best time. And so the first step, I'd say, in humility is trying to see things from the perspective of God's eternity, God's omnipotence. So if you just take the environmental thing again, I don't know if it struck you how absolutely contracted a time scale people are thinking in. And yet we say and should say and remind ourselves, 1,000 ages in thy sight, God's sight, is but an evening gone. So to expand your mind into thinking on the right perspective is the first step. And that cannot but, I think, if you do it properly, it cannot but induce a kind of humility. Look, you have your 70 years and 10, a little more maybe, we're hoping. You have your 70 years and 10. The transformation of the world is not for you to accomplish. And it's not for us to accomplish. So to be a disciple of Christ in and for your time requires to be understood entirely within this spirit of Christian humility. And can I just say on this connection, actually, I pushed this particular message from here on a few occasions, actually. But if you think about it, isn't this truly, truly astonishing? That God chooses the cross and the death of Christ as the fundamental strategy against what St. Paul's called the princes of this world. So if you think about that, it's really astonishing. We herald Good Friday as Christ the victor. How could that be? It's completely contrary to the way the world thinks. I mean, I just was in Washington and so on. I don't want to be excessively critical or anything, but I was struck when I was looking around the memorials, all the usual famous memorials. Franklin D. Roosevelt, I think it was, because they've got lots of sentences and so on. But perhaps I'm misremembering, but somebody describes it as the combination of force and righteousness. Well, yes, a righteous cause is terribly important. But the idea that means of triumph is to combine righteousness and force sits contrary to the cross.
So we'll open up to Q&A, and you can go first. But final observation is, you just spoke on Good Friday, but you also spoke about Holy Saturday. And that statement that you made probably made it into all my books. And every time I talk about my art, I say, well, my art is Holy Saturday, time of waiting work. And you had mentioned as well, I think, that music has this way, you can't have music without silence or pause. And so, in a sense, that framework of humility, at least for me as an artist, transformed how I view what I do as an artist. And can you elaborate if there's anything to be added there? But to me, I think that was one of the things I will never forget, you speaking from the pulpit. And reminding us on Holy Saturday that, you can do nothing about Good Friday because Jesus accomplished everything. You can't do much about Easter Sunday, but there's a lot we can do for Holy Saturday. What is that a lot there?
I think it's Simone Weil.
Yes.
Has this waiting on God, waiting upon God, and I think I remember once when I was at school actually, and they handed around the little addresses at assembly to the various teachers, and I remember this teacher emphatically saying when it was his turn, he just, and of course we were all there slightly inclined to chitter chatter and so on, and he just shouted, "Be still and know that I am God." And I thought that moment was almost something. We were still because he shouted at us, "Be still." And then he put in this message, "And know that I am God." And I think that this is something that is hard to do. There's lots and lots and lots of occasions and opportunities and calls upon our time and so on and so forth. And there's a temptation to think when you are still, this is for me to relax, me to let the strains and stresses flow away. But I don't want to get too close to my thoughts in the sermon, otherwise I'll be repeating myself. Here's the question. When you are still, are you giving that time to God? Or are you taking it for yourself?
Wow. Thank you for that. Alan, you had a question?
In the sweep of history, you described the tension of right, culture, art, theology. You're in the sweep of history, were those all most harmoniously productive after all was it Christendom? I think it was a huge artistic outpouring of things like that, but a lot of other bad stuff going on. Or is it never really had that in the sweep, that harmony?
So let me just repeat the question. In the sweep of history, the integration, I think that's what you're speaking about, art and philosophy and theology and the church and broadly. When was it the time that you can point to that we can learn from?
Well, I think in the sweep of history, there is probably no point. And that's because, and this is not a bad thing, art, philosophy, theology, ethics, faith, practice, they're all constantly in a certain kind of tension. Perhaps that's exactly how it should be. So if you just think of the analogy for a moment of family life, we want harmony, but harmony certainly doesn't mean that everybody says the same thing, do the same thing, walks in the same way. So relationships are built on differences and exchanges and tension, and sometimes, of course, they split and break. And we have to be honest, the church is not a model for that. There's been splitting and breaking, and and it's not, of course, not just the church. The old Jewish joke about the old man who is found on an uninhabited island says, "This is my synagogue." What's that? That's the synagogue I refuse to attend. And this Christians could, the same impulse amongst Christians is quite common, unfortunately, that there is some other branch, some other aspect. So I think all I say in the case of art, just to stick with that for a minute, that but it's true of philosophy too, that there are moments and works and instances, but art had classical roots as well as Christian roots, so it's always inclined to have an alternative. And so there are moments and works and places in which I could say, there you see. I would say that for an awful lot of J.S. Bach's music, I would say. There you see it, or hear it. There it is. And the same would be true of certain sorts of poetry.
And part of that is the abundance of God operating in the world. Even we may see it in some way as unnecessary, fractured, the church and the world. And yet there may be a way of understanding it, right? Looking back at history, listening to Bach's music. There's enormous complexity built within that, seeming harmonious path, right? So.
There is complexity. I mean, somebody, Wagner, I think, I can't remember, described Bach as God's craftsman. And I think that's a rather telling description, because there's never been a more brilliant composer than Bach. Whether it may be your kind of music or not your kind of music, it doesn't matter. It's just astonishing, and yet never does it seem to be about Bach. And I think that's a very telling example. But just to pick up on the point of abundance, yes, indeed. I mean, lots of differences, lots of conflicts, lots of disagreements. Those are part of the richness of life's tapestry. I think, though, as I've been saying already, the real sins from a Christian point of view are pride and self-assertion. And our culture often is so anxious about self-abasement. It teaches self-assertion, self-affirmation. You choose who you want to be as you want to be it. I understand how this happens, but that's, from a Christian perspective, that's precisely where you don't want to go.
Talk about humility. Bach's music disappeared for about 100 years, right?
Yes, it did, yes.
Mendelssohn
Yes,
discovered it. Yes, George.
So going to your specialization in Scottish Enlightenment philosophy, what would you say is the greatest gift that the Enlightenment gave Christianity, or did the Enlightenment give gifts to Christianity? And then, kind of on the flip side, what do you think is the greatest harm that the Enlightenment has caused Christianity?
The benefit and harms of Scottish Enlightenment.
Yeah.
In 5 seconds.
Well, in 5 seconds. The Scottish Enlightenment was just one aspect of this great movement of Enlightenment. And if I may step aside from the Scottish Enlightenment for a minute, the great philosopher Immanuel Kant wrote an essay called "What is Enlightenment?" And he identifies enlightenment as the willingness to think for yourself rather than simply adopt whatever it is that is being said around you. A willingness. And Kant believed that if we could get a culture like that, this is enormously advantageous and moves things along. And I subscribe to that. The difficulty is that thinking for yourself then becomes simply rejecting what other people say, or being determined to find your own distinctive spin or your own angle on me. Knowledge, understanding are communal products. You have to think for yourself, but you have to learn from all those other people thinking for themselves. And I think if I were to pinpoint a danger, it is this emphasis on being sure that you have your own slant and place and thought. But the Enlightenment, let it be said, of course, in some sense was displaced by the great movement of Romanticism right throughout the 19th century, and where in some ways I think that's where what really, really matters is feeling and emotion. This is the essence, on the Romantic view, this is the essence of integrity. And so the Enlightenment is correctly calling us to think, no, you aren't just heart, you aren't just feeling, you aren't just emotion, you are mind and will and thought, and integrating all of those things in the person I wouldn't say that, integrating all of those things in the life that you have been given. That's the key.
And it would be an amazing thing to consider, post-Kantian, post-Romantic, postmodern time to consider how can humility lead into integration of knowledge and affective side of our experience. So arts became fundamentally a portal into this kind of pseudo-integration. So museums began to get established and so forth in around the same time that you mentioned. And I never thought about this before, but maybe that is our Christian journey, is to integrate, maybe learn from the past, but also begin to forge a new path toward a newer type of leadership that is based on humility and character and so forth. Okay, anybody else with questions? Yes? What about children?
What about children?
How do you bring children into this conversation?
Well, I mean, there is a slight tendency to think that children don't count until they're adults. But actually, children are constantly being attended to and shaped and assisted and drawn into life through their position in families. Out of the mouths of babes and sucklings, and we said there are things to be learned. It's just like, how do you accommodate the very elderly? I mean, there's a strong tendency in our culture, I think basically between 20 and let's say, 60, this is the real thing. But actually, other cultures have venerated the very elderly, thought that this is where wisdom resides and so on. So I think, I just say, the way I'm trying to think anyway, wants to accommodate human beings at all their stages in development, and to find a place for them in the learning and the understanding. But just as in regular school, you have school grades, so I think in Christian education, you have to have grades as well. I mean, so what's lacking very often, at least in my part of the world, is serious education for Christian adults. There will still be Christian nurseries and Sunday schools for young kids, but when you get to this level, what is there? Not much sometimes.
Yeah, and that is a perfect place to land, because part of what I envision this series of conversations to be is obviously having people such as yourself help us understand philosophy, theology, and history, and so much that we want to know. But also, I think the idea of framing that through what society dismisses, right, as either unimportant or marginal or even unable or in some cases disabled. This point of entry is not from strength and pride, but point of entry is from weakness and vulnerability and community that builds upon it. I felt like when you were making yourself available here at All Saints for us, I felt that sense of communion with, the person who I see as a great mind, and yet you were serving this community, and I took that to heart, because I think that's, in a sense, what a future of education through the church can actually look like, and so, Roland, thank you for your presence here, and now you're back. We hope to have you back again. Perhaps we can go to Edinburgh and join you as well. But thank you so much for your service, and we look forward to the worship to come next and what you will have to say to us.
Thank you very much.